We welcome now Democratic candidate for Ohio Governor Ed FitzGerald. Mr. FitzGerald, good to see you.
Good to be here.
Are you relieved? I mean, supposedly now the Democratic field is cleared. Rich Cordray confirmed this past week as the director of the Consumer Agency in Washington, so it's all yours.
Well, I was happy for him. You know, I've known Rich Cordray for 24 years, since, I hate to admit it, but that's when I was a student last at Ohio State. And so I was very happy for him. He and I have been friends for a long time. I think it's also good for the country to get him, you know, officially established in his office. So I thought that was a good thing. I think it's a good thing for myself and my campaign too, because it lets us focus even more on the differences between Governor Kasich and myself.
Well, let's pick it up there. What are the differences? Tell us why you want to be governor of the state.
Sure. Well, I don't think the state is heading in the right direction. I think the recent budget is a great example of that, because I think it's been extreme in a number of ways. First of all, it raises everybody's sales taxes. Everybody's property taxes in the long run are going to be going up. It's done some very extreme things when it comes to women's health care choices. And I've just run my operations as both a mayor and a county official much differently. We've been fiscally responsible, but we've also invested in things like public education, early childhood education in particular. And I think there's a better route for the state to go.
Is that the governor or is it the legislature? Because a lot of what came out of the budget wasn't what John Kasich had proposed.
Well, he certainly,
the sales tax increases and what have you.
Well, he certainly celebrated it. So if he opposed it, he could have line item vetoed some of those portions, and that's one of the reasons why a few days before he signed it, I said, look, there are a lot of bad things in this budget, but there are some places where the governor really ought to draw a line and say this has gone beyond the pale, and he did not do that.
He did do that on Medicaid expansion, though. Are you standing side by side with him in that fight to get Medicaid expansion approved?
Well, I'd have a little bit of different approach, because I don't think he's had a very bipartisan approach. If you talk to the Democrats in the legislature, a lot of them are still sitting by the phone waiting for him to call, because virtually all the Democrats have said publicly that they're for Medicaid expansion. A few of the Republicans have. There's a majority of the legislature that I think that would enact it, but I haven't seen the governor do what I think he could do, which is really hold people's feet to the fire and say, okay, let's have a special session of the legislature to get this done. Or let's do what the governor in Arizona did, where they said, I'm going to start vetoing things until this gets a real hearing. That hasn't happened yet.
A Republican with an even more conservative
Republican with a very conservative party there, yeah.
You mentioned earlier women's health issues. What is the likelihood, do you think, of a voter referendum on these anti-abortion bills? That
I think it's just too soon to say. As I said the other day, there's three options that people have if they're outraged by those actions. One is the election next year, and I don't discourage people from expressing themselves that way. There's also, I think, a very strong likelihood of litigation. I think you're going to see that in the next few weeks, either on the state level or the federal level, because there's a lot of constitutional questions that have been brought into play by some of that legislation. And then there is an option to take things to the ballot. I will say we set up a website to ask people if they're interested, and we've had about 3,000 people sign up and say that they want to actually have a ballot initiative. But that's not something that either me or my campaign can do unilaterally. There has to be a coalition, and those conversations have started. We'll have to see.
Okay, so there's $1 billion plus in the rainy day fund now. The governor points to that and says, look, we've turned this economy around. Would you leave it locked up in the vault, or would you return some of that rainy day money to local governments, as an example?
I think first of all, I'd go back to what my experience has been as both a mayor and a county official. I've always believed in having healthy surpluses and having a reserve fund, because that's what, first of all, it's just good fiscal management. So I don't disagree with having a strong rainy day fund. What I do disagree with is, how do you get there? If you get it by unbalancing local government's budgets, whether it's schools or local communities, which has led to layoffs of teachers and firefighters and police officers and sheriff's deputies all over the state, that to me does not make sense. You know, the state budget is bigger than it's ever been, and a lot of that has been at the expense of small local government, and I disagree with that.
Let's talk education.
Sure.
Funding. How would your education funding look if you are elected governor for the state?
Well, again, I'd look a little bit about what I've done in my county. We've returned more money to local schools. We've had a special emphasis on early childhood education. Basically, every study shows that an early investment is what really pays dividends, and states across the country have really taken a leadership role on that. This state has not. Again, what the governor's approach was to really suck money out of local school districts. So there was originally over $1 billion, nearly $2 billion in cuts. They've replaced some of that money, but a lot of the money that has been put back into the system now has gone to some for-profit charter schools that have actually done quite poorly. I'm a believer in public education. I don't think that the recent budgets have really invested in it the way that we should.
Before you ask a question, Jim, also third grade reading guarantee, core curriculum, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that that's a complicated discussion that's going on right now. I think that there's some benefit to that, to have common standards. I think that's still ongoing.
So how is the campaign going? I mean, you've never run statewide before. You haven't served in the legislature, in the People's House. Some might call it something else in Columbus.
It's been called worse. It's been called worse, right?
That legislative experience. You are from Cuyahoga County. How is this statewide endeavor going thus far? Traction?
Yeah, it's going well. I mean, we were saying before we started filming, there's a lot of interest in this race, and to be presumed to be the nominee 16 months before the election is a good place for any Democratic candidate or any challenger to be, really, and that's a little bit unique. Usually things don't sort out this soon, so we have a long time to have a discussion. Here's the other thing I always tell people, Jim, is a good campaign is really a two-way conversation. It's not just me saying, hey, I've got all the answers to every question that's going to come up or every problem that people face. It's a dialogue, and I am learning more about the state. And there are differences between different regions of the state, but there's a lot of things that people have in common. There's a lot of challenges that they have in common, and I'm learning about those as time goes on.
What do you think folks here in Central Ohio, Southern Ohio should know about you? I know folks in Cleveland are very familiar with you.
Yeah.
Tell us about your family, that sort of thing.
Sure. Well, I just turned 45 the other day, so I'm officially
Old enough to run.
not young anymore, right? That's right.
I don't know if I like that answer.
Sorry about that. Sorry about that. Sorry, but we got to face reality,
Right.
okay? Let's face it. I've been married for 21 years. I have 4 teenagers, which also ages me, by the way. I have 2 boys and 2 girls. My career track has been, I spent about 8 years in law enforcement. I was a county prosecutor. I was a special agent with the FBI. And then I've been involved in local government. And that's really where my passion came for running for governor, is to try to make government work. I was a city councilman for 9 years. I was a mayor. And I was a county official. And we've taken a large government operation. We've made it more efficient and I think made it work for the people.
Mr. FitzGerald, we're down to less than 30
Yes,
seconds
sir.
now. Very quickly, on the severance tax on big oil, we talked about that a few weeks ago. You want to be more definitive this morning? Would you favor an increase on big oil?
I'll be a little bit more definitive for you, is that I think that there should have been a formula that was done with the oil and gas companies to say, let's negotiate a rate, but let's try to tie it to local employment. One of the problems, and one of the areas where I think the governor has dropped the ball is, yes, this drilling is going on, that's great. He proposed a pretty sizable tax increase on it, which failed in the legislature. But what should have happened, in my opinion, is a rate should have been negotiated with the oil companies, where they said, okay, this is what the rate's going to be, but it's going to be tied to hiring local people. Too many of the jobs that have been created as a result of the oil and gas boom are going to out-of-state residents. They should have been Ohioans.
Republicans and Democrats watching your campaign finance report, I believe that's due in a couple weeks. Will your contributions, will you be over $1 million total?
Well, let's put it this way. The governor at that point in his election cycle, so a year and a half before the election in 2009, was at about $500,000. So that, to me, ought to be roughly what the barometer is going to be.
All right.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for
Good to see
coming
you.
in.
Sure.
Thank you.